Day 4, October 23rd, 2017. It's not what you'd call an everyday job, but it pays the bills, and that's what I needed it for. Hello, my name is Mark, and I might be in a bit of a bind with my current employment situation, so I decided to start a daily log as a sort of coping mechanism. You see, I, like some others, work the graveyard shift. Now, before I begin, I'd like to overstate the fact that I have never had any history with dealings I couldn't explain. But after tonight, that may not be the case anymore. My job title? You guessed it. Security. To be more specific, security at a warehouse owned by Genesis Mannequins. This establishment asks that we as security personnel keep a lookout for thieves and trespassers, the usual stuff. Well, tonight, being the fourth day on the job, was more than I bargained for. I was wandering about on our little golf cart-inspired vehicle through the numerous lines of mannequin boxes, all the while my mind filled with the slogan of the company that was on practically all of the paperwork. A perfect appearance. My imagination was fast at work, making me swear there was movement in the corner of my eye. I was told it was a pretty common occurrence, being surrounded by what I sincerely learned to be the definition of uncanny valley. It sure didn't help that there were unpacked ones in certain areas we patrolled, a whole bunch of them at that. I was told these unlucky models were returned for defects or problems, and in some kind of process to determine if they were acceptable for resale. That said, if they failed, the poor fellas were bound to wind up in the recycling container. It's worth mentioning that there were 2 of us security guards working at any given shift. My coworker for the night, let's call him Todd. He was a stout fellow that towered over me by at least a sizable hat. Provided we were unlucky enough to have any foul encounters, he would no doubt serve as the muscles. Hey, I wasn't complaining. I always preferred the role of the brains. So some time passed and the night progressed with relatively nothing to speak of until about 1:30 in the morning. A loud banging sound began from the outer wall of the building. It was almost as if it was coming from outside. Hey Todd, did you hear that one? I chimed in between the familiar beep of the walkie. Yeah, seems like they might be paying us for something after all, he said in that familiar cocky tone. You wouldn't think that I'd gotten used to somebody working with him only 2 shifts, but let's just say Todd was that kind of guy. All right, let's see if we can find the perp, I finished, heading casually for the door. It wasn't but a moment before I found my way to the entranceway. Todd, however, must have been quite a ways away, because he took almost a full minute to rendezvous. After a brief discussion on the subject, we were almost certain at this point it was kids toying with us, being that it was the prime time of the year for pranks and all. You know how it is, making us run around, and when we go and check, they'd be laughing to their heart's content. All at our expense, of course. Safe to say we weren't too happy about it. However, as we neared the somewhat ill-lit area near the dumpsters, it was eerily quiet. Now, the concept was still plausible that children could be responsible, as the gates were quite low, very easy to climb, and had no barbed wire to speak of. We finally turned the corner, and what we saw was anticlimactic, to say the least. There was a dumpster. The same dumpster I'd since been acquainted with for the better part of a week. Now, mind you, it was eerie in its own regards, with the lights that hadn't been cleaned or replaced in who knows how long. But what made it all worse was the ever too common limbs that stuck out from the top and sides of the dumpster. I don't know, something just didn't feel right looking at it. What unsettled me the most was the lack of evidence, let alone a clue as to what had caused the noise. We had no explanation to speak of. As we looked around, there wasn't even a single sign of life. Guess these fellas didn't make the cut, Todd said, interrupting my thoughts with a mannequin limb dangling from his grasp. Despite his joke, the feeling of something wrong refused to let me off the hook, and frankly, his jokes were just bad. Not a second before I was about to tell him to cut out the antics and that we should just head back inside, there it was again, a loud banging sound, only this time there were several locations along the expanse of the wall. And to make things much, much worse. They were all from within the building. In seconds, we were sprinting towards the door, hesitant to even shine our flashlights inside. Judging from the distance apart, the banging had to be from at least 2 or 3, maybe more. I wasn't about to risk my life for a security detail that paid a fist above minimum wage. We ended up calling the authorities and explaining the situation. They ended up going in with guns drawn. Meanwhile, we just stood there outside, not really sure what to do with ourselves. After a while, I broke the silence this time. "What do you think it is?" I asked Todd, just to pass the time. "I'd say it's about 50-50 chance between cultists and sexual deviants. Hell, maybe both," he remarked, making a joke out of it as usual. But it was pretty clear by his shaky hands and the way he was stepping his foot. He was anything but in his comfort zone. Ever hear of anything like this going down in this place before? Being that he was the senior of the two of us, I had to know what I was getting myself into here. Not unless you consider a few pranks from coworkers. Then again, I've only been here for 4 months myself, so your guess is about as good as mine. As much as he tried to convey the whole macho man persona, his shaking boots weren't convincing anyone. But hey, I was just as shaken, so I can't even slight the guy. It was an uncomfortable minute, just waiting there in the silence. Neither of us really had anything more to say about it either. But then, just as I was going to take a look at my phone, we could see the flashlights inside, as the police came out with sour expressions. "Now, sir, there was a banging sound," the officer on the left asked vaguely to us both. "Yeah, it was clear as day. Almost like someone taking a piece of rebar to an empty steel barrel," Todd said with an earnest, childlike tone to his voice. It was the most serious he'd been since I'd met him. The officer looked at his partner, half rolling his eyes. Clearly, they weren't buying it. "Now look, fellas, I know your job out here is boring and all, but next time, do your damn job so we can do ours." The officers started walking off as soon as he finished. We both just kind of stood there shocked. We were so sure that somebody was in there, that multiple someones were in there, that we didn't really know how to react. I'd say a good 40 minutes passed with us just leaning against the cold steel walls, neither of us quite ready to step back in the building. But we couldn't just stand there all night. Let's just say time and the chilled night air got to us eventually. We may have been in the entranceway, but there was no way in hell we were going deeper. We hung out in the reception area, right next to the break room. About the only place that wasn't unsettling in the entirety of the warehouse grounds. It looked modernistic, where the lucky bastards who worked in the day would tackle the dangerous realm of shipment lists and invoices. You know, I used to dread those kinds of jobs, but this one made me start to rethink things. You went our separate ways, as we had any other day before, just with a completely different feeling. I really wasn't looking forward to tomorrow. October 24th, 2017. So I had some rather interesting follow-up with my employers via email. To give some perspective, that was how they handled the majority of the contact with the job. In fact, they were faceless. Now, you might be thinking the whole gig sounds shady or off-putting, but looking them up on some credible sources, they had pretty much nothing but positive reviews from past workers. It was weird considering what happened yesterday, but not quite weird enough for me to turn down $25 an hour. I know I previously complained about the wage, but that's easy to do in the situation and hard to do when looking at bills. So far, the money had been real enough, so in light of last night, I just couldn't bring myself to quit now. My shift today started a little early, arriving sometime around 9 p.m. It was already dark by now. Soon my second partner in crime, Jared, was due to be in. Now, if there was one impression I got from Jared in our short time of being acquainted, it was that he didn't like talking. If I had to sum him up in 2 words, it would be, don't bother. Now, that might be a bit harsh of me, because poor Jared didn't seem all there, at least in some regards. And maybe that's what made him obsessed with the little radio he carried with him everywhere. It was funny. You could always hear him coming by that damn thing, even though he himself didn't make a sound to speak of. Well, I'm heading outside for a bit, Jay. Keep me posted, I said to him as I walked out the door. I left in a hurry for 2 reasons. 1, I thought he might appreciate his alone time patrolling the warm interior of the building. And 2, I'm a selfish bastard who doesn't really like the idea of being in the building with all the issues that happened yesterday. But that got me wondering, was outside really any better? No, not really. But at least it was a clear shot to the gate if things went sour. I had chalked up the whole mystery of yesterday to one of those blue moon occurrences. The kind of reasons that rumors or legends get made. When the stars align at just the right point, something unexplainable happens that we just can't figure out. However, I hadn't given up on the logical explanation. I just had no clue how I was gonna prove it. Again, just like last night, there wasn't a peep. Not even the crickets had something to say. But I figured that was mostly 'cause it was getting a bit colder now. Roundabout's the time for them to start dying off. Still, it didn't do me any favors. Sure, I could hear every detail, but that meant every tiny leaf moving in the wind set me on full alert. Time passes a whole lot slower when you're on guard. But there was no way I could relax tonight. No way in hell. Somewhere in my disillusioned state, I had this complex that if I was expecting it, somehow it wouldn't happen. Which kind of worked, at least in my past. I was surprised when 1 o'clock rolled around and no sounds to speak of. I remember rejoicing in my head, having made it to the halfway point, only this time with a pleasant nothing to speak of. Just when things were looking up, it was about time to do a routine check on the walkie. Yeah, despite his rather cold demeanor, I didn't have the heart to leave the fellow alone when he might not even know what happened last night. Hey, Jared, how are things going in there? I asked as I walked, not really looking forward to this. For a good 5 seconds, it was silent. Then 10 seconds rolled around. It was looking strange, and I can't tell you why, but my gut was screaming at me not to open those doors. But sadly, some sense of empathy made me step right in. Jared, can you hear me, buddy? My voice not yet resounding anywhere within earshot. I debated with myself to enter the main portion of the warehouse to get a read for anything odd. Now, before I continue, I should overstate the fact that Jared was a bit of an old-timer. Not quite a Gramps yet, but not too far off either. His damn radio. That thing was always on full blast, so him not hearing the walkie, it was kind of an ordinary issue. So, for the moment at least, things didn't seem too bleak. That is, except for the location. I really got the creeps peering out into that main room. All those eyes looking back, without so much as a blink. For a good minute, I stood there, half inside, half outside the door. I didn't really have the courage to take the first step in. I had just noticed I couldn't hear his radio. The warehouse was big, but not big enough to hide the sound of his blaring radio. I suddenly had the bright idea to try the walkie again, and this time, to no great surprise, I heard myself in the distance. After mustering up some courage, I decided to take that first step. I kept tapping the walkie-talkie now and then, walking in the direction, hearing the familiar buzz of my voice. After a moment or two in the direction of the walkie, I heard the familiar buzz of the radio, with some station I didn't keep up with, blaring as what should be the usual. Though there was one strange thing about it. It seemed like the walkie's location and the radio were almost polar opposites. I didn't think too much of it at first, except maybe he had gotten tired of me trying to pester him and see where he was, and decided to put it out of earshot. In any case, I figured it was easiest if I just kept going after the walkie. Every now and then I would press the big black button on the side, saying some line to calm myself down. Though, with the state of the radio, my nerves got the better of me. That small thought in the back of my mind that something was wrong kept me from saying a word. So every now and then I would hear the white noise of the radio with the walkie's own buzzing. I used it as a way to gauge how close I was. The building's lights were spotty and left large gaps in vision, where there was a bright spotlight followed by a sizable gap of shadows. The contrast of the light and dark made them both stand out like a stage on Broadway. Frankly, if not for the fact of yesterday, or the nature of what's inside, it wouldn't have looked nearly as intimidating as it did now. It was clearly an old building, that was for sure. And to make things worse, changing a bulb wasn't exactly something we could manage easily. Saying little charms as I walked, I passed from the first spotlight, jogging towards the next. It felt so unnerving, being in the dark with the unboxed mannequins only an arm's length away, and the boxed ones staring me down, reflecting on the opposite side. After traversing a few spotlights, I could hear the walkie clearer now, but still it seemed so far away. I couldn't really explain it, but it felt like when I approached it moved away. Now I'd like to think it was my coworker playing a prank, but trust me, Jared isn't the type. I decided upon a full sprint while tapping the talk button of the walkie. My mad dash worked out pretty nice, as I could clearly hear it louder by the second. Unfortunately for my nerves, this quickly led me to my least favorite part of the warehouse. The especially defective or unique ones, if you'd like to put it that way. They were scattered in a mess. Hundreds of them, maybe even thousands, in as many poses as there were faces, each one more uncanny than the last. As my gaze trailed upward, I tried my best to avoid eye contact. As, in my frightened mind, that was a recipe to see something I really didn't want to. Taking a peek towards the sound slowly revealed the walkie-talkie in sight, but in a spot I dreaded it to be. There was a group of hodgepodge mannequins comprised of several different limbs from multiple bodies, different skin tones, and messed up faces. They looked almost as if they had been melted, but too real. So real that it felt many times worse than looking at the rest. I doubted myself for a good long moment, if there was even any reason for me to go and pick it up. Of course, again, my gut feeling told me a resounding, get the hell out of here. But some growing spite of the situation was tempting me to take it and run. I can't properly explain it, but the feeling you get when you want to spite that thing that scares you. I stormed up like a soldier, in the heat of the moment, ripping the walkie from the mannequin's hand. It had quite a grip to it, which didn't seem right in the slightest. Wasting no time, I turned and ran. I heard something shift behind me. I froze. When I shined my flashlight, I didn't notice anything in particular out of place, though I don't know if that was more or less problematic. Jared, if that's you, stop fucking around, I said with the adrenaline still fueling my temper. I didn't expect a response, as the music in the distance was still whimsically playing its tune. Even through the ambiance of the music, I could hear it. Something in the corner, almost like a whisper. It was a almost childlike tone. I couldn't make out what it said or if it was even real, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up all the same. Through my panic, I had noticed something I had overlooked. The mannequin I had previously taken the walkie from looked just a little bit different. Not so much that it had moved, but more like a slight change in expression. But I knew that wasn't possible. It was made of plastic and wood, or something like that. A moment later, I was still debating in my head where to run or what to do. A mannequin made that decision for me as it tipped over, my flashlight catching it as it hit the ground. I leaped into the air in surprise, and I could feel my heart beating from my chest. The fight or flight in me didn't know what else to do but run. The area was almost pitch black, and the mannequins were set up in so many random places that you really couldn't keep track of them. Worse yet, as I was running, I had to wade my way through them. So even though I hurried, running past the sea of mannequins, I couldn't go as fast as I wished. I couldn't avoid brushing up with them. Sometimes I could even feel as if they put up some resistance, like they were actually standing. Somewhere deep down, I thought to myself I must be hallucinating. At least some of it. Some of it was in my head. I was too shaken up, I can admit that. But what I couldn't do is explain why the walkie was there. I made a beeline for the music. I wasn't going to stop for anything. The music kept moving. It hadn't made any sense until now, but I never once heard a footsteps, not a single sound of life. This made things even more strange. I knew it's possible, more or less, to step without making a sound, but he was old, and not the most graceful even for his age. I seriously considered calling the police again, right there and then. But after last time, I didn't really fancy my chances with them. I had to at least see the radio. Something inside was screaming at me to know, to see what was actually going on here. Row by row, I followed the sound, which was now very close by the severity of it. I could hear it. I could hear everything, the DJ's voice and the station branding, but no, something was off about it. It was right around the corner, but something told me not to look. Chills like you can only imagine were dancing upon my spine as I dared to challenge my warning. I have no reason why, but I did it. But I can tell you what I saw made no sense at all. There was just the radio, sitting in a lone spotlight, the mannequins in their unassuming places seemingly untouched, and the classical song right out of the 50s playing. Yet no explanation, no evidence, no clues, just a radio and no Jared. I didn't have the heart to search anymore, so I wasted no time in getting back towards the exit. Walking towards the break room, I really needed some coffee after all that. To calm my nerves, to gather my thoughts. But then I noticed something. A little post-it note that seemed just so very out of place. It had in a messy, childlike scribble 2 simple words. I quit. While it was no doubt an odd way of saying it, I couldn't blame the old-timer at all. But why would he just stop and leave his radio like that? Was it his way of getting back at me for pestering him? I just couldn't shake the feeling that there was no way he would leave his radio for a prank. I mean, what kind of old man does this to begin with? I had more questions, but at this point, I was too exhausted to give it another thought. I walked right out those doors, hours before my shift ended, but didn't feel a single shred of guilt. No regret. On the bright side of things, I had a few days off to think about things. Like the prospect of coming back there. It was no secret that I left early, and I half expected to receive an email telling me I was fired. But instead I didn't really get anything. Conclusive anyways. Other than one email. This one was Kind of a strange way of them telling me. But the email from management just said plain and simple, "Dear Mark, please refrain from leaving early as security is paramount to the company's function." It all seemed tame enough. Too tame even. And it wasn't far-fetched to think that the security camera caught me on the way out. A direct feed to their posh home in some estate. No doubt they were making good money to be dishing out wages like these to security. On mannequins, of all things. Day 6, October 30th, 2017. Well, it's been a while, and at this point, I've had some serious reservations about going back there. Whenever I played back what had happened in my mind, all I got were questions. Something overall just felt terrible. The kind of gut feeling you get when you drive down one of those deserted roads and swear you saw something, only several times worse since there was no car to separate me. But the paycheck I got for my first week came in as well, and it was rather sizable. I didn't even know they gave bonuses. What's more, tonight was considered holiday, and according to the company's policy on the website, that meant triple wage. Now, I'm not one to cave to money, but the likelihood of me finding another job in a month's time, even in this area, would be a stretch, to say the least. I'm not one to push my luck. What's more, I can't really explain it, but I hate giving up on a job halfway done. Something's always driven me in my head, ever since I was a kid. I just have to see what happens. I have to see it through to the end. Uncomfortable or not. The drumming sound of the engine, the cold, crisp feeling of the October air filtering through my car ventilation system. It all felt so outlandish. Something was definitely itching at the back of my mind. It's almost like I'd missed a clue somewhere. Streetlight after streetlight passed, but not a soul on the sidewalks. Then again, it was nighttime in a fairly industrial area. Couldn't really blame anyone for avoiding a midnight stroll, or in this case, a 10 p.m. one. Before long, I could see the entrance. Now that I think about it, it all looked rather lonely, with the residential area so close, but separated by the cold, empty street. You could still see the silhouettes of people scurrying about behind the curtains in some of the more well-lit houses. Looking for distractions was pretty pointless when I was due to be there in just a few minutes. But even with all this, I couldn't help but take my time unchaining the gate. The heartless cold was now accompanied by the sight of my own breath. Being that they were mannequins and the minimalistic nature of the warehouse, it sadly meant no heated patrols for me tonight. Passing through the gate, I went to the parking area out back near the dumpster. Filled with the same limp limbs as usual, it was at least no more unsettling than before. As I turned off the car, it was dead silent again. I could see Todd's pickup in the distance near the outlying fence. It was an odd place to park, but I didn't think much of it. I hopped out, slamming the door behind me, and was greeted by silence. I thought for sure by now I would have heard something of Todd. He wasn't usually one to be reserved. But after what happened the other day, it wasn't hard to imagine. Heck, anything wasn't hard to imagine now. Walking towards the door, I heard a scratching sound near the dumpster. I really didn't want to turn back, since I was already halfway there, not to mention the fact I had my fill of scares for a lifetime. So instead, I decided to figure out where Todd was, and maybe forget to mention it. It was cold and windy too, so can you blame me? Brushing shoulders with the door, I forced my way into the less aggressive cold of the stagnant warehouse air. The howling of the wind at my back was the only sign of sound or movement that I could sense. It was growing increasingly unsettling, being that Todd wasn't in either of his normal spots. "Hey Todd, you in here?" I curiously prodded with my voice, looking through the spotty lighting of the main corridor. There wasn't a sound. Alarms went off in my head as I turned towards the exit, but I felt a cold stare at my back. I couldn't place it at first, looking all around, but then I noticed a figure standing in the break room. Somehow I had missed it in my first glance. It was a mannequin, one of the messed up ones from in the back. I fell off my feet as it moved slightly, sliding on its flat pedestal-looking foot. I fell off my feet as it moved closer, sliding towards me. I couldn't choke up enough courage to form words, scrambling instead to my feet as it now remained still in the doorway. My heart stopped as the light went off. I screamed bloody murder. For a long moment, I stood at the glass door, contemplating a swift exit, looking for movement. My heart racing now. My nerves now firmly ajar as I was tempted to just leave out the door and never come back. When I heard a laughing. Not what you'd expect, no. Not a creepy laugh, but a laugh that I was quite familiar with. All at once, the pieces of the puzzle came together. "Todd, you motherfucker!" I said, spitting fire with every word. The light turned on, and I saw his red face beaming with laughter, all the while at my expense. "What? I had to welcome you back with some kind of fun," he retorted, clearly viewing himself in the light, both figuratively and literal. "You call this fun? For you, maybe." I finished, letting him off the hook, if only for my joy of it not being what I had previously anticipated. "Damn, man, that scream, though? You give those girls from horror movies a run for their money," Todd said, still half chuckling to himself. Clearly still amused. "Come on, shut up. Shut the fuck up. Talk to me when you've dealt with my last shift," I said, kind of wanting to mention it, if only to probe if he had any insight or experience of his own. It was half to prove I wasn't going crazy, the other half to figure out this whole thing. Of course, he took the bait. "Wait, what happened last time? Does it have anything to do with that old-timer quitting?" He was quick to respond. "Wait, how did you know he quit?" I asked, clearly confused of his rather informed response. I mean, it was Todd we're talking about. His expression couldn't decide if he was puzzled or looking for the right words. But then he answered. "He didn't show up for my last shift, and there was a note." Todd finished with a now sobered expression. Immediately, I had to know. A burning desire to understand if he had seen it, if it was still there, even those many days past. "Wait, a note? What did it say? Where is it now?" I had to be sure. We were talking about the same note, and what's more, if we were. Why was it there for so long? I think it just said I quit on it. Now that you mention it, it's gone. Weird." His explanation only gave me more questions, but ones I knew he couldn't answer either. "Well, where did you last see it?" My curiosity fueled the interrogation onward. "I could have sworn it was here when I got in today, but hey, wait, here it is." His jubilance trailed into a more confused expression. He pointed at the mannequin that he had so ingeniously hid behind the door to scare me. You know, the one he went so far as to slide as well. But that was all irrelevant now. What didn't make sense, what made us both speechless. If he was telling the truth, the post-it note was now firmly in the hand of the mannequin. "Seriously, this isn't funny anymore. You did it, right?" I said to him, demanding the truth and nothing less. No, man, I swear it wasn't there. I didn't touch the note, he said with the same shook-up expression that he had during our first odd happening. A change of subject was in order, as the mutual discomfort at the lack of explanation was taking its toll on us both. So, how did you even lug this guy up here? I'll give you that much. You put the work in for this prank. Work-related consequences be damned, I guess. But what caught me off guard was he looked a little confused when I said that. This fellow was already here when I came in. Gave me quite the scare when I was turning on the lights. That's what gave me the idea in the first place. Like hell I'd go in there and move them around. Let alone, I've got half an hour before you show up. The earnest nature of his voice didn't portray him as a liar. At least not one that I could tell. That fact is precisely what made me uncomfortable. The fact that one, we would have to take the mannequin back through the sea of rejected ones. And two, the lack of a good reason why it would be in this room to begin with. There was a long silence. We just looked at it, back and forth, one to the other, and the note and the mannequin. But eventually we broke the silence. I guess this fella just needed a break, huh? Todd said in his more nervous tone, trying to break the deathly silence. After I didn't respond, he made his own response. Then I guess after he had a long break, he decided to quit, eh? To be fair, his joke was well placed, if only there's better circumstance. So what do we do? I asked him with a dark tone to my voice, clearly dreading what came next. I guess we take him back to his family. Even Todd couldn't make a funny out of this one. The main room seemed to get more and more unsettling every time you'd look into it, let alone when walking inside its empty halls. The endless lines of lifeless human husks. It was like you were being watched, like you were on display for their amusement. It was even worse because you couldn't really notice any difference, if there were any. If they were to have moved, it would be almost impossible to prove it. Their scattered placement, and dozens of poses and expressions, they were far too unique for it to be easily distinguished. The slogan of the company posted firmly on every packaging, well thought out details for a perfect appearance. It seemed harmless, but the perfection of it all just seemed too close to real. For a long time, we just stood in front of the door. We dreaded it. Todd's facade of bravery was whittled down as mine was never there to begin with. Todd's tough guy attitude seemed to force him into a difficult position. He wanted to prove that he wasn't scared, but he was too scared to really deny it. But boredom is a strong, strong force. Boredom and wanting the overtime pay. Somehow we managed to open the creaky door and wallow with the husk into the dark, half-lit room that was as big as it was uncanny. He grabbed the legs and I grabbed the head as we stepped down the few steps to the warehouse level, the chill of the air summoning clouds of pale from our weary lungs, lacking the bite of the wind, but making up for it with the suffocated feeling of being indoors. One thing that always seemed unnerving about the place was that there was no emergency exits to speak of, and the large steel garage doors were locked by a padlock the size of my hand. That always bothered me. If there was a fire or anything, you better hope you can get out of there one way, or you won't get out at all. Hey Todd, isn't there some kind of safety breach with there being no emergency exits and all? I asked, half to distract myself from the faces staring at our long trip. I think somewhere they rule the garage doors to be, but that doesn't exactly help us when they're padlocked. Company logic, clearly not practical. He finished with a sigh. The weight of the mannequin was far less an issue than the awkwardness of slipping it by the others without knocking one to the side. Sometimes we'd have to turn it one way or another, take turns putting him vertically to slip by the narrow walkways between the sea of creepy things. For better or worse, we were almost there. Eerily close to where I had heard the voice and saw the walkie being held by the one last week. To my surprise, the area looked as though it had been completely rearranged. Though, at least this made our job easier. The mannequins were more clumped up in groups like circles. They were in generally the same pose, almost like a football team, leaning in, hyping themselves up before the game, just lacking any of that team cheer. It was strange, and we tried to avoid them. We didn't really know where to put the fella. Not wanting to split hairs on the subject, I made a suggestion. How about we just leave the guy here? I think it's close enough, and who's really going to know the difference? I cut through this insatiably heavy silence. For a long moment, again, there wasn't a break in the silence. It was almost like I was alone down there. Again, not a feeling I wanted to relive anytime soon. "Todd?" I said, prying for a response. "Yeah, sorry, I just thought I saw something," he said, before dropping the mannequin lightly as I did the final push, righting him into his stance. Shining my flashlight towards Todd, I could see him spacing out, almost glancing one way towards the corner and then towards me again. I didn't really know what else to say, so I made a suggestion. "Well, how about we worry about that after we get clear of this area?" I was feeling chills up and down my spine, and frankly, I didn't have a good feeling about any of this. "Todd?" I cast my voice, half whispering towards him, but he was clearly staring at something now. I shook his back, but he didn't respond for a painfully long minute. "I can hear them saying something," he said in an uncharacteristic voice, under his breath. I didn't want to know. I was on my wit's end with all of this, in this place. I didn't even know why I went this far. I grabbed him and tried to get him to follow. "Snap out of it, Todd. Now's not the time for this." "Come on, Todd," I said, lacking as much command as I wished, but my fears, they got the best of me. What happened next, I have no words to explain. In the time it took for my flashlight to fall as I struggled with him, the mannequins in the circle had moved ever so slightly. Their gazes, which previously were focused on the center of the circles, were turned slightly in our direction. It was still unclear of what they were looking at, but I couldn't handle the chance anymore. "Todd, run!" I bolted, tugging his hand as he clumsily followed behind me in his sorry state. I could hear a rustling behind us and a suffocating silence from the front. Step by labored step, we progressed through the sea of the mannequins. Every now and then I'd swear I saw movement, but not just behind us. No, glances to the side, revealing slight movements within arm's reach. It was all just theories and fear, doubts in myself until it happened. I felt a strangely posed mannequin that looked as though it had fallen over touch my foot. I can't explain how this happened, other than it brushed up in a way that just couldn't have happened normally. It couldn't have been performed by an unmoving, lifeless doll. Todd was still slowing our pace to a near standstill, with the noises behind us evolving into a new form, like breathy, lifeless growls. It was a strange melody of clicking and growling. It was unclear of what it was, though my mind painted a clear enough picture, one of pure horror. There was still the explanation of some kind of cult or something that was hiding among the mannequins, or in suits that blended in, but the details, I couldn't find them. Where could they have been? I wanted one single thing: to be free of this area and free of this job. It was now to the point where Todd felt almost as though he was dragging his feet on me, making me so blisteringly mad that I looked back at him and I yelled, "Todd, hurry the fuck up before I leave your ass." I regret turning. I still regret it. To my abject horror, there was no Todd. No. In my grasp, there was a mannequin firmly in his place. I had no idea of when or how they had switched, but somehow they did. And they did so without my knowing. As I ran, it was clear that it must have been when the mannequin brushed up against my leg. All of my focus was drawn to the terror for just a moment. I must have let go of his hand. But how did I get a hold of a mannequin? I tossed the mannequin spitefully to the side, making sure it suffered, if it could even suffer. I could hear the banging on the walls of the building now, like drums, like a chant. It was several times worse than it had ever been. It was clearly and resoundingly coming from the many different locations. I fumbled for my keys, with my icy digits digging through the pockets of my coat and pants one after the next. Gone. My keys must have been taken or fallen out during the quick pace of the escape. I was rattled, completely at a loss. I regretted everything, leaving Todd behind in my last-second decision, not so much knowing a single detail of what was going on. Was he even alive? I dared not think such things. Instead, I asked myself, what would be the safest approach to save Todd once I get through these doors? I couldn't help thinking about the keys. Passing through the doors, I now headed firmly towards the car. Checking my pockets, I noticed another frightening detail. I didn't even have my phone. In a panic, I began to think, where can I look next? And like a light in my head, perhaps the most obvious idea came to me. Go for help, locally. With some of the houses that still had lights on, I could get them to call the police, and then maybe rescue Todd. I sprinted towards the gate, hearing the drumming of hits against the wall of the warehouse until its abrupt return to silence when I was about 10 steps off of the gate. It was a shoddy little chain gate that you could hop right over, so it wasn't long before I passed it. No cars passed to speak of, but luckily there were still some homes with lights on, the promise of a solution just within sight. My hopes were still high that once we got the police involved, we could figure out what the hell was going on in this place, or at least get away safe. Approaching the first house, I knocked twice. Hello, is anyone there? I work at the warehouse across the street, and I was hoping I could use your phone. Even before I finished the words, I could already understand why they weren't rushing to open the door. I waited patiently, minute after minute. The uncanny shaking of my body wouldn't stop. Anxiety wreaking havoc on my nerves. Please, I really need to help my friend. See, he could be hurt, and I need to call the police. If you can hear me, just call the police for me at least, won't you? Tell them to send some help to Genesis Mannequins at the warehouse across the street. To my dismay, there was utter silence. But something struck me as odd now. I couldn't hear any sound from within the house, but was sure the lights were on and the television as well. Not a single footstep. A single word spoken. Still, there was utter silence. But I just attested this to someone who must have fallen asleep on the sofa. I couldn't really look in, so that's all I had to trust with it right now. I didn't have the time to waste solving that little mystery. I sprinted to the next one, knocking on the door, mirroring my question and getting a similar response of nothingness. This time, however, I couldn't attest it to someone sleeping. No, there was clearly some form of silhouettes in a standing position. What's more, an opportunity presented itself to me. The illuminated figure in the large bay window. There looked to be an angle at which I could see who was inside. I must have looked rather suspicious in my mannerisms going towards the window, stepping past a rather large shrub plopped right in front of the landscaping, and subsequently the entranceway. But somehow I made it. Looking into the living room, everything seemed pretty normal at first. There was a woman and a man, one sitting and the other standing, watching television. At first glance, it didn't strike me as strange at all. But then all at once, I froze, my second glance betraying something I had never considered. Something that made no sense whatsoever. They were mannequins. They were lifeless dolls like all the rest. As I peered in a moment longer, the lights eerily went off. The other buildings mirroring in almost identical timing, till I was all alone in the cold darkness again. I noticed the sound of a door opening in the distance from some house I had yet to explore. I was far too scared to give in the temptation of curiosity. They were all nothing more than just twisted dollhouses in my mind. I had to get out of here, and my options were more limited by the moment. At my current state, it seemed I would have to dive back into the belly of that beast, or walk my way home those 20 cold miles in the near 0-degree weather. With the wind peaking and my coat ill-suited to it, I didn't fancy my chances. I decided regrettably the only thing for me was to try and go inside with some kind of weapon. Something you think I would have had as a security personnel. And to be fair, I did, but pepper spray doesn't do too well against things without eyes. I made a beeline towards the dumpster, deciding there might be something of use that I could defend myself with. It all seemed so surreal. Every time it wasn't right in my face, I kept thinking back to it. I must be going crazy. There must be something wrong with me. But something sobered me when I looked in that dumpster with all those mannequin limbs strewn about, like a discarded doll or action figure after a bad day. One after the next, I sifted through them. Heads, arms, legs. They had it all in that messy little dumpster. But something was off about it. They all felt too real, just like before. If not for their hard plastic or wood covers. I eventually came to a conclusion. I would freeze to death before getting anything more than a leg. But at least the leg would serve as a makeshift club in the right circumstance. Approaching the entranceway took all of my courage. The sounds were so faint and sparse that the wind covered them, if they were anything more than my imagination to begin with. I put my back against the wall, near the clear glass double doors, that were the only entrance or exit in or out of this eerie place. Not knowing what to expect, I took a deep breath and told myself, no matter what I saw, I wouldn't make the mistake of giving away my location. I convinced myself, on the count of 3, to look no matter what. 1, 2, 3. I turned, trying to reveal as little of myself as possible to any creatures that might be lurking within. To my surprise and relief, there was nothing, at least within the short corridor of the entranceway. The break room was to the left, and the supply closet was sitting opposite to it. Then a bit further, still within eyeshot, was the entrance to the main warehouse, which was exactly where I didn't want to be. But provided my phone was in the break room where I left it, I wouldn't have to be going in there at all. Opening the door as quietly as I could possibly manage, I listened between every movement, every breath, for any sign of life, or whatever you might call those scurrying things all about. To no great surprise, I couldn't hear anything more, even being the few steps in that I was moving towards the break room. I slinked, hugging the wall and making damn sure I stayed low. Once I was within arm's reach of the break room, I took a small moment, my nerves getting the best of me, as I could hear something. I couldn't place it exactly, but it was definitely coming from the main room. It was like a moaning, groaning sound that beyond my first clue was impossible to place where exactly it was coming from. Turning to check the break room, I was heartbroken. My phone was gone. Falling into a defeated slump, I couldn't believe what I had to do. I contemplated waiting there until morning, but chances are if that sound was Todd, he was in trouble. And even worse, what if they come looking for me? Sure, I'd have the exit, but Todd was there in that situation, partially because of my fault. I discussed a game plan in my head, but nothing really felt right. I didn't even know what I was up against. Was it just my mind after all? I still couldn't help but wonder. It was a hard concept to get ironed out. What was actually going on? Where's the clue I'm missing? What could possibly be the reason for this? I decided to quell the arguments with a look through the small window and the door leading to the main corridor. It was dark and lonely, with only the unassuming presence it always had about it. It would almost have been easier if I saw something move or some conclusive evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. And the place was A giant red flag of danger and death that I could just avoid, that I could just run and take my chances against the cold. But for whatever reason, it didn't give me that. It didn't let me have that. The warehouse was painfully aware of how much I wanted to run. It wouldn't let me have hopelessness, no. It dangled it in front of me. Just a glimpse of hope that I could make my way in there, find Todd and get the keys, all the while remaining safe. I know I was a fool. I sluggishly turned the doorknob with all the subtlety I could manage with my shaking hands. Luckily, there was little to no sound produced from this part of the delicate procedure. The next, however, was all but unavoidable. Upon pushing the door, my worst fears were avoided by a temporary solution. I managed to avoid the creaking by lifting up on the handle, forcing the door frame up to avoid its jagged course with the hinges that appeared to cause the sound. With muscular control that rivaled the gods, I managed to avoid making much of a sound at all. But now I could hear plenty in the distance. It was almost like a cross between a heavy breathing and a painful chant. Whatever the case, whatever it was, I began my combing of the ground, desperately looking for any hint of my keys or my phone. It was too dark, so I had to sweep the concrete. It was painfully clear to me in the first few moments that something had changed within this room. Something drastic. I peered down one long row of boxed mannequins, only to find a large pocket of darkness staring back at me. I knew it was the same general direction as the sound, but also of the area. I never wanted to go back. There had to be a way to avoid it, a way to get around it. But all my thoughts came up disappointingly empty. What's more, on occasion I could hear a crackling. What made things so much worse is on occasion I could hear a cracking, almost skittering sound that would travel in places that didn't make any sense. Once towards the wall, and then sometimes at the very top of one of the rows, several stories high. I didn't want to think about it, but kept a mental note just in case it decided to get closer, so it was still quite a ways away. I didn't want to think about it, but kept a mental note just in case it decided to get closer, as it was still quite a ways away. I was gripping that damn leg like a loaded shotgun, ready to crash it into any and all signs of movement. The breathiness led me, as spitefully as it could, precisely where I'd expected. But that didn't make the sea of mannequins any less intimidating. Which ones were real? Which ones were fake? Was there even a real or a fake one to begin with? Were they just mannequins or people in suits? My mind raced with theories, but nothing gave me any hints. Many times worse was the fact that my combing and perception had yet to give me any clue of the whereabouts of my keys or phone. While I made sure to avoid the gaze of any mannequins I could, it was an impossible struggle. There were thousands of them, maybe even tens of thousands. I hadn't dared to exit the dark area, hoping if they could see me, that my whereabouts in the dark would keep them at bay. For now it seemed as though it was working. I almost felt a little bit relieved for the first time that night. But then it was like something read my mind, like something knew what I wanted to see more than anything else. Another human being. There he was in front of me, facing the other direction. No, not Todd, but Jared. I had no idea why Jared was there. The only plausible reason I could think of is that at some point he came back for his radio, because there it was with him. He looked almost too normal, but still something felt very wrong looking at him. It was the stillness that got to me, that and the lack of his radio being on. Reluctantly, I tried to sneak around to get a better look. There was absolutely no way I was going to call out to him, let alone make a sound. Something felt too off. Where was he all this time? Why did he come back now? All of these doubts kept mounting. And let's face it, my gut had a pretty flawless record going through all this. As I snuck around for what was likely many, many minutes, I began to see his side eventually. His arms were resting gently at resting pose as he just stood there relaxed. To be honest, it disturbed me how much he looked like them. Only he was too real. It was clearly him. There was no making a mistake, but one thing did look different. His eyes were all glossed over, and there looked like there was bruising around them. I couldn't really tell from the distance other than he looked exhausted, and whenever he blinked, it was a long, slow process. Before I could finish my examination, he jerked his head towards my direction, and I froze. I slinked as slowly as I could, down in the darkest shadows, as to not draw his attention. I eventually nestled myself in between two mannequin boxes on the shelf. A new familiar sound presented itself to my less than willing ears. The familiar sound of Jay's radio, but it was nothing but white noise. That alone was unsettling, but what came next was nightmarish. All at once a new sound presented itself to my less than willing ears. The familiar sound of Jay's radio, but it was nothing save white noise. That alone was unsettling, but what came next was nightmarish. I could just barely see him through the cracks between the boxes. His movements were unnatural and exaggerated, like a toy soldier or a puppet strung up, stammering about. I start to hear syllables, changing from the stations one after the next. It was comprised of the borrowed voices of so many different radio stations, songs, DJs, everything. Some I couldn't even recognize. When I realized what it was, my heart threatened to stop at that very moment. It was asking where I was. That thing, that Jared look-alike, was clearly searching and getting closer by the second. As he closed the distance, I could see what so bitterly disturbed me. It was that his eyes were not his anymore. There was something gruesome wearing his skin, in a way that if it hadn't moved, would have fooled me, someone who's known him. A little closer it skittered, as I could see the blue hue to his skin. Features that come from the bruising of a truly horrible night. I didn't know what to do. Between the sounds and sight, I could try and run, but then it would see me for sure. I could try and be still, but it might know where I am already. The two choices danced upon my thoughts, but were ultimately useless as indecision made the choice for me. Looks like I was hiding out. Luckily, I was wedged in between two of the human-sized doll boxes quite deep in there. When Jared moved, there was a sickening popping sound that reminded me of butchering meat. It was clear now. Whatever that was, I needed to avoid it at all costs. Its pace quickened to a startling, twitching run on all fours as the wet and gruesome sound perpetuated, escalated. It was fast, extremely so, scaling up the wall in an unnatural way before skittering out of sight towards the ceiling. I was glad I hadn't run at this point, as there was no way I could outrun that creature with all the adrenaline in the world. I looked out. I could hear it someplace far away. It must have thought that I made a mad dash without it seeing for the exit, as it looked to be making its way towards the entranceway. For now the choice was clear, painfully so. I had to explore the other sound. Something told me deep down that's where I would find Todd. Or my keys or something. What concerned me was what else I might stumble upon in the sea of mannequins. Now making a silent jog towards the inner workings of the place, the breathy sound was now clearly presenting itself as near eye shot away. I didn't know if I wanted to see, but the sound of the door opening in the distance made the decision for me. I went as fast and as carefully as I could through the sea of mannequins towards that mismatched area, seeing clear movements as the heads of the mannequins I passed stared me down, tracking my every movement. The cold, dead eyes refused to give me a moment to myself. You think it would have terrified me, but there was almost no spare feeling of fear left to give them. Just a lament, a despair, a tiny glimpse of hope dangled in front of me, lingering in the back of my head. I just had to see what that damn noise was.
As I reached eyeshot of that wretched place, I could see something. It was Todd, all right. He was laying down in the middle of a half dozen of those things. There was one standing over him and swaying from side to side as he looked as out of it as he had been when I last met him. I wanted to scream out to Todd and tell him to run, but something made me hesitate. Something beyond the fear of them turning to me and whatever fate we would share together. No, it was a horrible mix of shameful curiosity and fear of getting another stare. I didn't want a chase. I didn't want anything. I hated it. I needed a moment. But I hated it more because I was so purely hopeless. I didn't even know what I was dealing with, let alone how to fight it. The mannequins, almost on cue, when I had gotten close enough, began their sick ritual or whatever it was. He was alive, at least for now, but the mannequin standing over him slowly descended. It was so strange and uncomfortable due to the fact that his expression wouldn't change. He was staring in his half-lit eyes up at the mannequin that now had its wooden hands just inches from his head. Slowly, it pressed against his lips, reaching finger at a time into his mouth. I wanted to be a hero so bad and stop things right then and there, but there were so many of them. You have to understand. He seemed defeated, lacked any kind of panic for what might happen next. Then it came, that moment that happens when you've had enough, but don't know how to look away. I could see it, what it was doing, even if I couldn't have guessed the end result. The creature was pressing against his upper and lower jaws. With a meticulous gauge of pressure, still, his expression wouldn't change, couldn't change. Something was very wrong with him, his silence making it more sad and eerie than outright gruesome. Next came an echoing crunch, as his jaw was dislocated or broken, the mannequin using surgical prowess. His eyes didn't so much as tear up. There was little to explain what happened next. It began to place both of its hands down his throat in an equally methodical approach. His choking sounds were muffled as the creature began its second attempt at expansion, this time stretching the length of his throat both directions. There was no telling how strong those things were, but it made his throat much larger, inhumanly larger, taking breaks in between the stretching to avoid his suffocation. The creature continued this motion many times, until it was a sufficient size for its next step. It began to widen the cavity with relatively no blood spilled yet. His too calm breathing didn't mirror what was being done to him. It was horrific, and how drawn out it was. How methodical. The creature took its next step and began to shove things deeper and out of the way. Organs and presumably many other aspects of life just shoved aside within its pursuit of making space. His noises were somehow still persisting even after the creature had made so many different spaces. One rib came out, then the next, with plucks from its wooden digits. His chest still rising and falling with the lift of lungs filled with life. The creature was somewhere between being a surgeon and a butcher, doing things in some manner of subtlety, all the while treating his body like a husk, like it was made of plastic. Soon its intentions were clear, as it placed a slender leg in his throat, and then another, reaching deep into his chest cavity. The twitching of his body at its advance was unsettling and truly inhumane. The mannequin began to slither its way deeper until it hit where the organs it had pushed aside were, or perhaps bones. A sickening crunching sound happened all at once as the creature forced its way deeper. its slender arms removing excess bones one by one, taking what seemed to be extra care to avoid any necessary organs or things that were crucial to keep him alive. In its place, I watched its arms slip into him like he was a piece of clothing, it gaining the motor functions that were rightfully his. The living gutting of pounds of excess flesh and bone, piling beside his now helplessly compressed existence. It was awe-inspiring in some way that you just can't express. It turned to his head after finishing with the other limbs, in no time at all, but it did something I didn't see coming. It didn't remove the skull, no. It sufficed to compress it, in a way that it had room to slither in, with its wooden face, to control the muscles. It wore him, and saw through his eyes, completing its horrible assimilation, as I could just barely read it on his lips. Perhaps it was just me thinking I saw it, or maybe it really was that he was mouthing, "Make it stop." It just kept repeating, and I didn't even have a tear to shed for my former coworker. Just a feeling of surreal, like none of this could be real. It was a long moment as the mannequins seemed to dance about and around the newly combined one, in a method of praise as the blood and guts were quickly picked up and swallowed whole by the mannequins, until it looked as though no blood or bone ever existed there. Then, within the scope of my dismay, I contemplated if running was even worth it. I was, for all intents and purposes, surrounded by God knows how many of those things. Somewhere inside myself I found the resolve to convince myself I wasn't about to let myself be one of their skins. I turned abruptly as I saw them all stare at me for a small second. They opened their mouths as the cracking sound and breathy noise permeated the air behind me, mirroring to my sides. It was now so various that I couldn't place it, as the whole of the building fell into pitch darkness, as the power had been cut. I turned on my flashlight and could see them crawling at amazing speed, up the walls and on the ceiling, their lifeless mouths agape and their hissing, breathy screams echoing through the large area, their faces firmly, perpetually facing me in their scream, their jaws dancing about, up and down in unnatural ways. The first approached me and tried to tackle me. I barely managed to dodge it. Another tried a half-second later to get in my way. I hit it with all the weight I could manage from the mannequin leg, causing it to stagger for a moment, giving me just enough time to get by it. I sprinted full force, faster than I even knew I could, through the endless lines of boxes that lined the rows. Each one banged on the plastic, making a mirrored loud noise as it rocked back and forth against the metal that it sat up upon. Some of them fell over, and some of them were escaping. I recognized it now. This was where we had heard the banging on the side of the building. Some of them were hitting the walls. Clearly they weren't happy with living inside the boxes. It was so loud that it drowned out the screams of the ones pursuing, and each and every one of them looked more furious than the last, their silent, breathy screams claiming the air. I nearly tripped from one of the crawlers that insisted upon nipping at my feet. They were trying to bite me, hopelessly relentless, and they slowed my sprint to a haggard drudge. I was still progressing, but things were looking especially grim as I shined the light up, seeing them skittering across the ceiling and walls like spiders, all with their gazes never leaving me once. Their screams so loud, yet so very near the silence. They were strong, but luckily not coordinated. I managed to fend off several at a time with the leg and a few kicks of my own, but their numbers were quickly wearing me down. The door was now in sight towards the break room, and if I was lucky, the exit. The last few meters were upon me, and I could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Making a desperate leap for the door, I managed to grasp the handle, but not before I had the mannequin lock its grip on my leg, then another quickly after. Swinging the leg was enough to distract one, but the other had sunken its jaws into my leg, drawing a bloody mess in its wake. It was agonizing, but I managed to kick it off, not without losing a few pounds of flesh in the process, unfortunately. Closing the door behind me was only a temporary solution, as the familiar buzz of the radio found its way to my unwilling ears once more. It didn't take much imagination to figure out what the little radio had said to me. Found you. The husk of Jared barreling towards me in a cracking mess of broken humanity. Or something worse. I leaped with all my energy I had left, with my good leg towards the service closet, which luckily for me was unlocked, and locks from the inside without a key. Right before the ghostly blue Jared could open the door, I slammed the lock. I heard so many things in that dark little room. There was skittering along the walls, banging, the same yelling hiss sound with little fingers wandering beneath the door. I could hear it, their voices. Jared's voice called to me without the radio. They told me to come out. And then, worse yet, Todd was quick to join the voices. I didn't have the heart or the energy to try peeking under the door. I tried to mend my wound as best I could, but I was feeling quite cold now, and sleepy, so I did the only thing I could as my energy wore down. I closed my eyes, decided to take a nap, hoping for the door to hold. I wasn't sure what I could hear anymore. I think it will hold the night. I opened my eyes again, but wish me luck. I'm sure I'll need it.
Day 7, November 3rd, 2017. I'm teaching the new recruit today, and I couldn't feel more vibrant. Things have gone great since the little accidents have been handled. It really is quite the job. The new recruit looks promising, too. Perhaps it's too soon to say, but I think he'll fit right in. Not to mention he seems to really understand how important the security personnel are to the company. Oh, did I mention? I managed to get a promotion. Now I sometimes visit the hiring and management office. It's a pretty cool place. I may still teach the new guys, but I've got a bright future ahead of me. Would I do it all again? Of course. Me and Todd are still good friends. But he transferred to a different department. Jared's still a strange one, but he'll warm up to us eventually. So if you know anyone who wants to work security for a reputable and well-paying company, please send me a message and I'm sure we can find you the job of your dreams. And as always, you can count on Genesis Mannequins for your perfect appearance.